There's an ancient story about a man called Moses and a burning bush. Moses hears God's voice speaking from a burning bush. When I hear that story, it makes me want to see burning bushes, or at least to hear God's voice clearly. There's a fascinating discussion about that ancient story that plays with the idea that God didn't wait to speak out of the burning bush for Moses to come along, that in actual fact God was speaking all the time. And that Moses was maybe the first to stop and to take notice and to hear what God was already saying. Maybe there are burning bushes everywhere. Maybe God is speaking all the time, but I am too busy to stop and to notice. There is an idea of thin places. It's interesting that I think most of the thin places I've heard of are outdoors in nature, which is interesting when human beings tend to try and build temples and churches as spaces that are good to sense something more. I like the idea of thin places, places where we can sense or glimpse that there is something more than what I can see or taste or hear or sense in the normal way. I've played before with the idea of two different sets of glasses in previous sermon series. I have a set of sunglasses actually that cause a bit of fuss in our family, because we'll be out somewhere and I'll say, "Oh, look at those amazing colours on that hillside," and the rest of the family will look at me a bit weird. And then I'll take off these sunglasses and find that the hillside looks completely different, because the glasses have got a tint in them that help make things more clear but completely change the colours when you look through it. The reality is that most of us see things, perceive things through all sorts of filters and lenses and perspectives. Even today on the Zoom worship, we can see each other's faces, but we're not seeing each other as we really are. It depends on our bandwidth or our screen resolution or the lighting in our room, or maybe the filters and the lenses that we have on our cameras. We are looking together at a letter. It's an ancient letter written by a man called John to encourage groups of Jesus followers scattered around Asia in the 1st century in the Roman Empire. And John uses all sorts of images. John wants to help the people he's writing to see things from a different perspective. He doesn't actually say anything new. He reveals again ancient deep truths about, he believes, the living Jesus of Nazareth. The last image that he had us thinking about was the image of the living Jesus knocking on the door of these groups of Jesus followers, on the church, wanting to be with them, to share with them, and some of them not realizing that. Here in chapter 4, he moves on to a new angle, and he describes another experience. He says, "Look, there before me was a door open in heaven." A door open in heaven. Now, we've seen before in these stories that the word heaven can mean sky, but more often means where God is at work. So not a place in the sky, not above, not a place far away, not some sort of reward in the future, but heaven as where God is at work. And if heaven is above us in any sense, it's not far away above, it's actually pressing down on our reality. And that plays into the idea of the thin places. In this vision John is having in chapter 4, the door is open. And through that door, John gets a glimpse behind the curtain, behind the scenes. Sometimes people get the impression that this letter, the Revelation, is a dark, scary, confusing book. And if that's true, then John is a terrible writer, and God is doing a really bad job of inspiring John, because John says that's not what he's aiming for. He's not aiming to confuse or to create secrets. Instead, he wants to reveal simple things. Maybe we have listened too much to what other people have told us about this letter instead of just having a look at what it says itself and seeing in there a fairly simple story where the Lamb wins. And some fairly simple messages like, God is at work, hold on, and repeatedly, don't be afraid. Knowing the Jewish story is really helpful when reading Revelation. And it really helps. It's the Jesus story after all. Knowing the background to the first century area and what was happening in these particular times that these letters are for and what was happening in the Roman Empire of the time is really helpful as well. It gives depth. But at the same time, it can't be necessary to know all that background to get the simple truths out of this letter. John says that this experience happened when he was in the Spirit. He said at once, I was in the Spirit, and there he could see more. John wasn't in a building. John wasn't in the temple. John wasn't in a church. But John was doing what he regularly tells us he did, which was on the Lord's Day, on Resurrection Day, on a Sunday, he was worshipping. Despite the fact he was locked down on this island, he was worshipping. And in worship, it acted like a thin place. And he was caught up in God's presence. That's what the idea of the Spirit is. And there he was given a new perspective that he then describes. He sees, through the open door, a throne. Now, John's going to talk about a throne nearly 50 times in this letter. The throne is only mentioned 55 times in all the Jesus stories. John really likes the image of a throne. He gets excited about it. And one of the reasons this would have been a powerful image is that the image of a throne was a reality shoved in the faces of these groups of Jesus followers every day. The Roman Empire was built on the idea of power and pressure and about getting their message across. And so in the flags that the Roman soldiers carried, in the coins that you had to use in your purse to buy into the system, in the pronouncements that were made in the street, in the games and the different processions that were set up to celebrate victories or just to get the message across, the image of the throne of the emperor and the emperor on his throne wanting to be worshipped as a god was regularly forced into their faces. And it would be easy for these groups of Jesus followers who had their own story of who their God was and what he had made them to be and wonder actually what is going on with our story. And here John describes a throne behind the scenes, a throne that is completely overwhelming in his description of this space, as if John is playing with the idea of the empire and their throne and saying there's actually only one throne that is worth noticing, and it's not the fake news image of the emperor on his throne. No, this is about a living God on the real throne. He starts to describe it. John is an artist. John is wonderful with words, but even he knows that his words are not going to be enough. He repeatedly says it had the appearance of, it was like. He knows that words are going to fail him. My son decided one day when cutting the grass to cut a rainbow shape into the grass. A little tribute to the NHS. It is really smart. Looks great. But it's not a rainbow. Because rainbows aren't green. Primary school children can tell us that rainbows aren't all green. So when somebody like John writes that the one on the throne had the appearance of jasper and ruby, and we could get all tied up in the details, but in actual fact, experts don't even know what half of these materials were in the terms that are used in them. But when someone says a rainbow shone like an emerald, which is green, around the throne, we know, well, this person can't be trying to describe an accurate picture of what's really happening, because we know what rainbows are like. That's not what is going on. John, his descriptions throughout the whole of this letter are like an explosion, like a cut and paste images from his empire that he's sitting in, and also from his Jewish story that he's so seeped in. And so when we have flashes of lightning, when we have rumblings and peals of thunder, when we have 7 lamps, when we have a sea of glass or like crystal, then if we were his Jewish listeners, we would have all sorts of images being fired up in our imagination, reminding us of books of hope like Ezekiel, and stories of kings, stories from their times when they were at their lowest and that they needed inspiration, like Isaiah, where God was described in these ways. Thunder and lightning reminds them of their great story of being saved as slaves from Egypt and then taken to a mountain where their God met them in thunder and lightning, and it was so overwhelming that they couldn't handle it. The lampstands were in their temple, which is where their system at that point told them they could meet with God. And this idea of a sea of glass could well be a reference to King Solomon's temple, where a huge bronze bowl was known as a sea would sit in the temple. But at the same time, John doesn't limit himself to these particular ideas, because at the same time, a great Jewish idea was that the sea represented chaos, and that God brought order to chaos in creation by calming the waters. And so maybe a sea of glass is one that has evil and chaos flattened out and made clear. And the image of a rainbow is a great image from their stories in Genesis, in that set of poems and stories in Genesis, and the Noah story where God put the rainbow in the sky as a sign of one who could be trusted, a God of mercy. The images of a God who is completely overwhelming, but at the same time a God who can be trusted. John is excited. But in actual fact, as amazing as his descriptions are, as overwhelming as his descriptions are, and the experience must have been overwhelming, what he's most excited about is that there is someone on the throne. Because the risk would be to think that God wasn't in control, that God wasn't at work, and John is saying, no, that's not the truth behind the scenes. That's what I'm seeing through this open door, that God is on the throne and God is at work, and he's not alone. In this image, the throne is surrounded by 24 other thrones, and seated on them are 24 elders. And we might wonder, what does this represent? Well, it could represent all sorts of different things, and John knows that. There were 24 different kinds of priests that worked in the temple. The Roman emperor would regularly appear at the games with 24 bodyguards around him. But perhaps more significant, there were 12 tribes that represented the Jewish people. And Jesus himself chose 12 students to be with him and learn from him, and to bring a new revealing that God's story was not just for the 12 tribes of Israel, but it was always for all of God's people. And so a powerful idea is that the 12 tribes and the 12 disciples represent all of God's people, who were always meant to be part of what God is doing. And we're told they're dressed in white, and they wear crowns, and they have thrones. And this is just again, John saying again what he said in the last 3 chapters, that dressing in white is about being pure and not giving in to the pressure of the empire, and getting a wreath, because that's what the word meant, a crown, is what runners get at the end of the race. And having a throne means getting to rule with God. And God's rule is not about ordering people around. God's rule is about taking care, about helping his creation become what it was made to be. And these elders, these representatives, if they are of all God's people, get to take part in that. God is on the throne. God is overwhelming and puts all empires and emperors completely in their place. And God has always made us, all of his people, to be part of what he is doing, to share in the work he is doing. That's what John is seeing in this thin place and through the curtain. And it's no accident that he's seeing it as he worships. Because what are these 24 elders doing? What are all the other creatures in this scene doing as they respond to the one on the throne? We'll find out next week.